Behind the doors of a mansion worth $50 million, far from the streets where ordinary Americans struggle to make ends meet, JD Vance stepped into a world few ever see. A world where power is traded over wine, where billionaires whisper plans to shape the nation for themselves. That night, JD didn't just attend a meeting. He walked straight into a trap. The most powerful men in America threatened him, tempted him, tried to buy him. And in that moment, when everything he stood for hung in the balance, JD chose courage. He left them speechless. But the question lingers, at what cost? Would you, in his place, have had the strength to say no? This is a story imagined to bring those questions closer to us. A reflection drawn from real hopes, real struggles, and the timeless search for courage. The names and moments may belong to fiction, but the feelings, the choices, the stakes, those are true in every way that matters. As you listen, let it stir something in you. When power speaks in secret, who will have the courage to answer? Stay with us, because sometimes the truth isn't behind closed doors, but in the courage to open them. It arrived on an afternoon like any other, the kind of day filled with endless paperwork, muted phone calls, and the steady hum of an overworked office printer. JD Vance had been in his Senate office for hours, sifting through reports that blurred together. Figures on job losses, shuttered factories, broken promises. The struggles of the very people who sent him to Washington weighed heavy on his mind. And then came the knock. A junior staffer appeared in the doorway, holding out an envelope with both hands, as if unsure whether to deliver it or set it down and walk away. "Senator, this just arrived. No return address." JD barely glanced up. He was used to mail, invitations, requests, demands. But when he reached out and felt the envelope's weight, something in him paused. It was heavier than any letter had a right to be. The paper was thick, the kind that whispered of money. The edges were trimmed with gold so fine it seemed almost absurd. At the center, an embossed seal. No words, no names. Just an emblem, a lion's head framed by laurel leaves. A symbol that reeked of power, but revealed nothing. JD turned it over, searching for clues. A sender, a smudge of ink, a watermark. Nothing. It was as if the envelope had materialized out of the air, from nowhere and everywhere at once. He broke the seal, slowly, deliberately, and as he unfolded the crisp card within, his eyes caught the first line, printed in elegant black script. A private gathering of America's visionaries. No date, no location, just a phone number and a time to call. 9 p.m. tonight. JD leaned back in his chair, the card between his fingers, and felt an old, familiar unease crawl up his spine. A gathering of visionaries? He almost laughed. He could picture the room already, men who flew private jets from city to city, who hadn't walked a factory floor in decades, if ever. Men who called themselves visionaries because they had the means to shape laws, buy influence, bend the arc of the nation toward their own ends. And yet, there was that part of him, that same part that had kept him awake through so many nights on the campaign trail, that whispered, what if you could see for yourself? What if, just this once, you sat at the table and learned what they plan when they think no one's listening? He set the card down on his desk, glancing past it toward the framed photo of Jackson Street, a street that didn't glimmer with gold or pride itself on embossed seals, but bore the cracks and scars of promises unkept. His mind flooded with memories, the shuttered grocery store, the playground with broken swings, the houses with sagging porches where mothers sat and wondered what would happen when the last factory closed. Visionaries. JD clenched his jaw. The card remained on his desk like a challenge, like a trap, like an opportunity, and somewhere in that moment he realized this wasn't just an invitation. This was a test, but from who and for what? That's what kept him staring at that card long after his staff had gone home, long after the lights of the Capitol had dimmed, and long after he knew, in his gut, that once he dialed that number, there would be no turning back. And as the clock crept toward 9, JD Vance found himself reaching for the phone. the weight of that envelope still heavy in his hands, as if it carried not just paper and ink, but the fate of everything he believed in. The weight of that envelope seemed to linger long after Jody set it down, as if its presence had seeped into the room itself. The Capitol dome glowed faintly through his office window, a cold reminder of where he sat and who was watching. The clock's hands edged closer to 9, and with them came the quiet thrum of doubt. He reached for the phone but hesitated, his fingers resting just above the receiver. Then, almost without thinking, he picked up his cell instead and dialed a number he hadn't called in weeks. "JD?" The voice on the other end was tired but steady. Will Darnell, his oldest friend, his sounding board since long before politics had a claim on either of them. "Did I wake you?" JD asked, though he knew the answer. "You don't call at this hour unless something's keeping you up. So no, I'm up." JD let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He told Will about the envelope, the seal, the invitation cloaked in mystery. And as the words left him, the room seemed to shrink, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Will didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low, careful. "JD, you know what that is. That's not an invitation. That's a leash they're hoping you'll put on yourself." JD stared at the card on his desk. The lion's head stared back, silent, smug. "You think it's that simple?" JD asked. Will chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Nothing's simple in that world. They don't send gold-edged envelopes to folks they respect. They send them to folks they want to own." The words hit hard because JD knew they were true. But that voice inside him, the one that always wondered what happened behind closed doors, wouldn't let go. And then came another voice, softer, older, as if carried in on the night air itself. "Don't trust a smile that hides the knife." Mama's warning. He'd heard it 1,000 times, but tonight, it felt like a hand on his shoulder steadying him. He could almost see her sitting at the kitchen table back in Middletown, cigarette burning low, eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that came from living through hard years. JD rubbed his temples. The choice wasn't as easy as walking away. If he stayed out of that room, what would they plot without him knowing? What would they shape while the people he'd sworn to fight for slept, unaware of the deals made in their name? "I don't want to play their game, Will," JD said quietly. "But if I don't step onto the field, how do I even know what game they're playing?" Will sighed. "If you go, just remember why you're really there." And JD knew then what he had to do. He wouldn't go to join them, wouldn't go to flatter them or bargain for favor. He would go because someone had to see, to hear, to remember. Outside, the Capitol's lights flickered against the night sky, and JD felt the weight of his decision settle over him like a coat he could never quite take off. His hand moved to the phone again, steady now. As he dialed the number from the card, the lion's head seal caught the light. And JD wondered, not for the last time, whether the trap was already closing around him. The dial tone had long since faded, but its echo seemed to hum in JD's ears as his car wound its way through the hills that hid the estate. The night air outside the window felt heavier now, as if it too bore the weight of what lay ahead. Trees gave way to stone walls and then, at last, to gates. Gates that didn't just mark a boundary, but announced it. Gilded iron, polished until they gleamed beneath the estate's floodlights. The kind of gates meant not to keep intruders out, but to remind them they didn't belong. As the gates swung open, slow and silent, JD caught his first glimpse of the grounds. A long, curving drive flanked by hedges trimmed within an inch of their lives. Fountains that rose like silver ghosts in the moonlight. And beyond them, a mansion that seemed carved from marble and pride. Balconies with wrought iron railings. Windows tall as church doors. Lights glimmered from within like watchful eyes. The tires crunched on the stone drive, the sound far too loud in the quiet night. JD's hands tightened on the steering wheel as his mind flickered, unbidden, to Jackson Street, where the only light at night came from porch bulbs on the verge of burning out, and where cracked sidewalks buckled like scars beneath tired feet. Where fountains didn't dance under moonlight because there were none. Where gates, if they existed, sagged on rusted hinges and dared no one to care. The car came to a stop beneath an arching portico. Before he could reach for the door, a man appeared. Sharp suit, expression sharper, eyes that flicked over JD like a scanner. The door opened without a word, and JD stepped out, feeling the subtle shift in the air. Inside, the mansion swallowed him whole. Polished floors that seemed too pristine for footsteps. Walls lined with paintings of men who stared down at him with the same cold appraisal as the man at the door. Chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen rain. The kind of wealth that didn't speak. It whispered, because it never needed to shout. And the people. JD took them in as they drifted through the great hall and into adjoining rooms. Men and women dressed in tailored precision, smiles that didn't quite touch their eyes, conversations conducted in the hush of power. A hand on his shoulder, polite, firm, guided him deeper into the house, toward a room where glasses clinked and laughter hummed, low and knowing. JD kept his face neutral, his stride measured, but inside his senses sharpened. He felt the stares when they thought he wasn't looking. Measured, assessing, as if he were already part of some unspoken calculation. What could he offer? How far would he bend? Who did he think he was, walking into their world on their night? And with every step, JD knew this wasn't an invitation. It was an audition. The door to the inner room opened, spilling warm light and richer voices. JD crossed the threshold, the marble cool beneath his shoes, the scent of expensive cigars threading the air. The game had begun, though no one would name it. Somewhere deep in the part of himself that never forgot where he came from, JD felt the quiet promise form. Watch. Listen. Remember. The night wasn't his, but what he did with it, that would be. The door eased shut behind JD, sealing him inside a world that felt at once opulent and suffocating. The grand hall stretched wide, its marble floors gleaming beneath the glow of chandeliers that dripped crystal like icicles captured in mid-fall. The light they cast was soft, golden, the kind of light that made every surface shimmer and every flaw harder to see. Voices rose and fell in a rhythm of hushed tones, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the low hum of music that was barely music at all, more a suggestion of harmony than a melody to be followed. The air smelled of old money, polished wood, aged scotch, cigars rolled by hands no one in this room had ever met. JD moved slowly, observing, absorbing, each step measured so as not to draw attention, but to invite it on his terms. They noticed him, of course. They always did. The outsider in their midst, the man who had walked through their gilded gates and now stood among them without bowing his head. And as JD scanned the faces beneath the chandelier's glow, he realized how many of their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. The first to approach was a man whose handshake felt like ice wrapped in velvet. The media mogul. Silver hair, a tailored suit cut to perfection, and a voice smoothed by decades of shaping headlines. He spoke JD's name like an old friend would, but there was no warmth in it, only ownership, or the expectation of it. Senator Vance, I've been hoping we'd meet. You've made quite the impression in Washington. The words were coded in praise, but JD heard the weight beneath them, the reminder that impressions could be made or unmade by men like this. Before JD could reply, another figure slid into view. Younger, sharper, his smile wider, his eyes colder. The tech billionaire. The man who spoke of connection while profiting off division. He extended a hand and said nothing at first, simply letting the silence fill the space, daring JD to break it. When he finally spoke, it was with the ease of someone who believed the world owed him its ear. You've got backbone. Rare these days, dangerous too, for the wrong people. He didn't need to say who the wrong people were. His glance toward the media mogul said it for him. JD kept his face calm, his grip firm, his voice even. Dangerous how? For who? The billionaire's laugh was soft, almost kind. Almost. You'll figure that out, or you won't. And then came the senator. Familiar face, familiar game. A colleague who, in the Capitol, wore the mask of ally, but here let it slip just enough to reveal the agenda beneath. The senator leaned in close, voice low. You're playing a risky hand, JD. Be careful who thinks you're bluffing. JD met his gaze unflinching. I don't bluff. The senator's smile flickered, then returned, wider and emptier than before. Around them, the room continued its quiet theater. Deals made in half whispers, promises implied but never spoken outright. Laughter rose in pockets, but it was laughter without joy, the kind that filled space but not hearts. And JD felt it again, that sense of being watched, measured, weighed. Every word he spoke, every look he gave, taken in and filed away for later use. And as he stood beneath the chandelier's light, JD understood with bone-deep certainty. This was no gathering of visionaries. This was a court, and he was being judged. The laughter drifted behind JD as he stepped away from the knot of cold smiles and measured glances, drawn deeper into the estate's labyrinth of polished corridors and hushed rooms. The farther he moved from the grand hall's golden glow, the clearer the night's true purpose became, not in what was said to his face, but in what was whispered when they thought no one was near enough to hear. JD found himself in a side chamber, dimly lit, its windows tall and arched, opening onto a terrace that overlooked the estate's sculpted gardens. The air was cooler here, the voices clearer, as two men, both familiar from headlines but not from handshakes, spoke in the low, casual tones of those who no longer feared being challenged. If we rework the protections on domestic manufacturing, we can shift the jobs overseas without the same blowback. The press will spin it as modernization. JD froze. His breath caught, but he forced his posture to remain relaxed, his gaze fixed on a painting above the mantel, as if he admired its brushwork. A second voice, silkier, chimed in. It's not just manufacturing. Small-town retail's ripe for consolidation. Once the independents fold, we buy up the real estate for pennies, flip it when the rebound comes. It's basic math. The towns won't recover, but that's not our problem. JD's heart pounded, not with fear, but with fury. The words came so easily to them. The devastation they described so clinically was the life's blood of the communities that raised him. Families who measured their future by whether a mill stayed open, a corner store kept its lights on. His mind raced. He could step forward now, confront them, call out their scheme in the moment. But what would it earn him? A polite dismissal? A quiet blacklisting? Maybe worse, a forced exit that would close his ears to whatever else they planned to reveal tonight. And so he stayed, silent as the marble beneath his shoes, listening as the blueprint of betrayal unfolded in the shadows. And if the senator plays ball, we grease the path. He gets our backing, we get our reforms. Everyone wins. JD felt the sting of it. The senator. Were they speaking of him or another, or did it even matter? Tonight's game wasn't about names. It was about loyalties, about who could be bought, who could be bent. The conversation drifted toward other topics: tax loopholes, regulatory rollbacks, strategies to sell the public on plans designed only for the powerful. But JD had heard enough to see the shape of the night. This wasn't a scattered gathering of the wealthy. This was a coordinated effort, a machine fine-tuned to squeeze the last breath from places like Jackson Street, to hollow out the very heart of the nation while calling it progress. He stepped back from the doorway, careful, quiet, feeling the cold seep into his bones. The estate no longer looked grand. It looked like a fortress, built to protect not people, but the plans made at their expense. And as he made his way back toward the main hall's warmth, JD's resolve hardened. He hadn't come here to join them. He'd come to see. And now that he had, there was no pretending he didn't know what he knew. The warmth of the main hall felt artificial now, like the heat from a fire that gave no comfort. JD re-entered the gilded space, the chandeliers still casting their soft golden light, the low murmur of conversation flowing like a current beneath the clink of crystal and the faint strains of music. But where earlier he had felt like a guest under scrutiny, now he felt something sharper, as if the room had judged him, found him wanting, and decided to act. It didn't take long. From across the hall, a man approached, not hurried, not hesitant. His steps were measured, his posture relaxed, as if every inch of this place belonged to him. The kind of man who wore wealth like a second skin. JD recognized him immediately, though they'd never met in person. One of the tycoons whose name topped the list of America's richest, A man whose companies spanned industries, whose donations shaped policy, whose reach extended far beyond what headlines ever captured. Senator Vance, the man said, extending his hand, his smile warm in a way that felt rehearsed. I've been hoping for a quiet word. JD accepted the handshake, because to refuse outright would be to declare war too soon. The grip was firm, but not crushing. A handshake designed to convey power without arrogance, as if to say, I'm strong enough that I don't need to prove it. The tycoon guided JD toward a quieter corner, away from the largest clusters of guests, though JD sensed eyes still followed them. No word spoken in this house was ever truly private. I'll be direct, the man began, his voice smooth, practiced. You've made waves, JD, good waves, in the right circles, and we believe you have a future, a real one. But you'll need the right friends, the right backing. That's where we come in. JD said nothing, letting the man speak, though already he felt the heat rise behind his collar. Not from the room, but from the quiet rage building inside. There are reforms coming, the tycoon continued. Changes that are necessary for competitiveness, for growth. We'd like to know that we can count on your discretion, your cooperation where it matters. In return, he paused, smiling as if they shared a private joke. We can make sure your next campaign is not just funded, but untouchable. JD stared at him, the weight of the offer settling between them like a stone. It was as clean as bribes ever came, dressed in courtesy, delivered with a smile. For a long beat, he didn't speak. He thought of Jackson Street, of Mama, of Papa, of the neighbors who'd lost jobs, lost homes, lost hope because of deals struck in rooms not so different from this one. He thought of the factories that once hummed with life, now hollowed shells, and now here stood a man offering to help him, if only he'd helped them first. JD's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. That's generous, he said, letting the words hang, letting the man think just for a moment that he might accept. Then JD extended his hand again. The tycoon smiled wider, moving to shake, but JD's hand didn't close around his. Instead, JD's fingers rested there, open, steady, before pulling away. No deal, JD said, his voice steady as stone. The tycoon's smile faltered, just for a second. Think carefully, Senator. The next offer may not be as kind. JD's gaze didn't waver. Then it wasn't kind to begin with. And as JD turned back toward the hall, toward the crowd and the confrontation he now knew was coming, the weight of that refused handshake set the stage for a night that none of them would forget. The clink of crystal echoed through the hall as the guests were summoned to dinner, their conversations folding neatly into the rehearsed choreography of wealth. JD moved with them, though each step felt heavier now, as if the ground beneath this house had turned to stone. The dining room was vast, a cathedral of commerce dressed in mahogany and gold. The table stretched the length of the room, polished so fine that it reflected the flicker of candlelight like water. JD took a seat halfway down the table, flanked by men and women whose names filled donor rolls and corporate charters. Across from him, the tycoon who'd made his offer met his gaze with the faintest trace of amusement, as if to say, "You're still here." That means something, but JD kept his expression calm, his mind sharper than ever. Servants moved silently, laying before them plates so artfully arranged they resembled paintings more than food. Rare steaks glistened beneath delicate sauces. Wines older than JD's career were poured into glasses that caught the light like jewels. The air was thick with the rich aroma of the feast, but to JD it smelled of something else entirely. Pretense and the cost of pretending. The toast began early, the glasses raised not in gratitude, but in quiet self-congratulation. To opportunity, one guest offered, his voice smooth, his smile effortless. To the vision that keeps America strong. Glasses clinked, but JD felt the chill beneath the words. Opportunity. Here, it was a code, not for lifting up, but for stripping bare, for the chance to gut small towns, to modernize in ways that lined pockets but hollowed communities. JD watched as heads nodded, as laughter circled the table like smoke, as deals were sealed with nothing more than a wink, a word, a handshake unseen beneath the linen cloth. He shifted in his chair, the discomfort gnawing at him. The table itself seemed a symbol of everything wrong in this room. Long enough to prevent real connection, cold enough to remind each guest of their station, polished enough to reflect faces, but never truths. Here, people didn't break bread together. They carved out pieces of the world, divided them, and claimed them as spoils. The tycoon raised his glass next, his voice carrying just enough to command attention. To those brave enough to see beyond old ways, and to the leaders willing to stand with us as we build what comes next. His eyes found JD's as the words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. JD lifted his glass, but only to his lips, letting the wine touch but not warm him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The refusal was in the silence, in the steadiness of his gaze. And in that silence, he felt the table grow colder still, as if it too understood the line that had just been drawn. The plates were cleared, the next course began, but JD tasted none of it. His mind was on the factories left empty, the schools closed for lack of funding, the families who would never sit at such a table, but who would pay the price for the deals struck upon it. And as the dinner stretched on, as laughter rose again and promises were traded as easily as salt and bread, JD sat unmoved, knowing this night was no longer about survival. It was about choosing sides. As the last course was cleared, the room shifted. The clink of glasses softened. The low hum of conversation fell into purposeful silence. JD felt it, the subtle tightening of the atmosphere, the shared anticipation that something more than dinner had brought them all together. A door at the far end of the dining room opened without announcement, and a man in a suit so precise it seemed cut from shadow stepped inside, wheeling a slim cart bearing a polished wooden case. Without a word, the man placed the case on the table nearest the tycoon, unlocked it with a small silver key, and withdrew a sleek tablet. The chandeliers dimmed, hidden projectors hummed to life, casting charts and diagrams onto a screen that unspooled from the ceiling like a stage curtain. The first slide glowed in sharp relief against the dark-paneled walls, a map of the United States dotted with red and green markers. JD's eyes narrowed as the presenter's voice, crisp and rehearsed, filled the room. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the opportunity landscape. These red zones, legacy manufacturing hubs, outdated retail clusters, communities clinging to inefficient industries. Here, he tapped the screen, is where we can modernize, redirect resources, consolidate operations, encourage market-driven solutions. The words flowed smoothly, dressed in the language of progress, but JD saw through it. Each red dot was a town like the one he'd grown up in. Each inefficient industry was a lifeline for families already hanging by a thread. Slide after slide followed. Tax strategies, deregulation pathways, legislative timelines. One chart showed how worker protections could be streamlined to boost competitiveness. Another mapped out regions where small-town real estate could be acquired cheaply once local businesses collapsed under the weight of the coming changes. JD's stomach clenched as the screen lit up with a list of legislative sponsors. Names he recognized, names he had shaken hands with in the Capitol. Names of colleagues who spoke of community on the Senate floor, but sat quietly now as their complicity was laid bare. The room murmured approval at key points, the soft chorus of agreement chilling in its restraint. JD felt like a man watching a storm form on the horizon, knowing it was set to flatten everything he'd ever fought for. For the first time that night, doubt crept in, heavier than he expected. What difference could one voice make? The machine was bigger than he had imagined, more polished, more precise. These weren't men grasping for power blindly. This was a network, a strategy, a blueprint of betrayal drawn with care and executed with patience. He shifted in his chair, feeling suddenly small against the scale of what unfolded before him. The temptation to stand, to call it out right then, burned hot in his chest. But so did the knowledge that a single outburst would achieve nothing but his removal. He had come to see, and now that he had, he needed to remember, to plan. The screen flickered through its final slides, projected profits, anticipated savings, a future where those seated at this table would thrive at the expense of the forgotten. The lights brightened, glasses were lifted, and the pretense of civility returned. But JD sat unmoving, the cold weight of the betrayal settling deep, and the question gnawed at him. Could he stop this? Could he even slow it? Or was he just another voice lost beneath the noise of deals already done? The room, now aglow once more beneath the chandeliers, buzzed softly as glasses were refilled, and the mood shifted back to polished ease. But beneath the smiles, beneath the low laughter, JD felt the chill linger. The kind of chill that came not from the cold, but from seeing the truth too clearly to ever look away again. The blueprint of betrayal still played across his mind like a film he couldn't shut off. It was then that the tycoon, the same man who'd offered JD the handshake dressed as a leash, rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table. He held his glass aloft, his voice warm, practiced, carrying easily through the hall. Before we retire for the evening, he began, I'd like to raise a toast to someone I believe represents the future of principled leadership in this country, Senator Vance. His gaze swept the table, then rested squarely on JD. A man of conviction, of vision. A man I trust, wise enough to recognize when opportunity and responsibility meet. The room turned toward JD, their faces expectant, their smiles thin as paper. The tycoon's words were smooth, but JD heard what pulsed beneath them. The warning disguised as praise, the offer disguised as flattery, the leash disguised as a crown. JD lifted his glass slightly in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Instead, he let the moment stretch. His eyes moving slowly across the faces turned his way. Hollow faces. Faces that wore the mask of camaraderie. But behind them, calculation. Every nod, every smile, a transaction in waiting. Every promise made tonight would be broken tomorrow if profit demanded it. And in that pause, JD's mind slipped elsewhere. To Jackson Street, to nights when Mama sat at the kitchen table balancing bills against a paycheck stretched too thin. He saw Papa's calloused hands as he came home from the factory, tired but proud because his work meant something, because it put food on the table and dignity in the doing. He saw the cracked sidewalks, the faded paint on neighbors' houses, the storefronts that had gone dark one by one as jobs left and hope with them. Mama's voice echoed in the corners of his mind. Don't trust a smile that hides the knife. The tycoon waited, his glass still raised, his smile still fixed. Around him the room leaned in, hungry for JD's answer, ready to welcome him fully if only he would give them the right words, the right gesture. JD felt the weight of the moment press against him, but it didn't bend him, it hardened him. No more games. He returned the tycoon's gaze steady and unflinching. He raised his glass a fraction higher, not in agreement, but in defiance so quiet only the man watching closest would see it for what it was. JD drank, a sip only, the wine bitter on his tongue. Then he set the glass down carefully as if marking the end of something. The next move would be his, and it wouldn't be made at this table, on their terms. The tycoon's smile didn't falter, but JD saw the flicker behind his eyes. The game was still on, but JD Vance had chosen his side, and it wasn't theirs. The clatter of silverware faded, the last of the plates cleared by silent staff who moved like shadows at the edge of the room. The wine still flowed, but the air had shifted. No longer the easy hum of a dinner nearing its end, but the expectant hush of a room that sensed something unfinished. JD felt it as keenly as the gaze of the tycoon at the head of the table, and the subtle, almost imperceptible nod he gave toward one of his associates. A senator, one who had said little all evening but watched much, cleared his throat and rose. His voice, smooth as polished wood, filled the space. Senator Vance, he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, perhaps you'd do us the honor of offering a final toast, a few words to mark the evening, from a man we all respect. The request hung heavy, a velvet glove hiding the iron beneath. The room turned toward JD as one, faces alight with polite anticipation. But beneath that, JD saw what they hoped for. They wanted flattery. They wanted alignment. They wanted confirmation that he'd stepped fully across the line, that the handshake he'd refused could be rewritten with a speech that would bind him to them in a web of their own making. For a moment, JD remained seated, letting the weight of the ask settle over him, feeling the tension coil tighter with every heartbeat. Then slowly, deliberately, he rose. The scrape of his chair against the polished floor sounded louder than it should have, echoing off the high ceilings and drawing the room's attention even closer. He picked up his glass, but didn't raise it. Instead, he let it rest lightly between his fingers, as if it were a prop in a play he hadn't agreed to star in. The room waited. The air thickened, the kind of thick that comes before a storm. JD let his gaze travel the table, meeting eyes holding them just long enough that smiles began to falter at the edges. Then he spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the room not with volume, but with purpose. "I'd like to tell you a story," he began, "about a man I knew, a good man, worked at a mill back home for 20 years. He was never late, never complained, always did more than what was asked, put his kids through school, kept food on the table, paid his taxes, voted, believed in the promise of this country." JD paused, watching as some at the table shifted, unease flickering like a draft through the room. And then one day, the mill closed. The jobs went overseas. The town dried up. That man, he lost his house, his family scattered, his wife's health failed. And through it all, he kept asking one thing. Why? JD's voice grew quieter, but somehow heavier. Why did the country he gave everything to stop seeing him, stop hearing him? He let the silence that followed speak louder than any toast. He saw the discomfort ripple through the room. Glasses lowered, gazes turned aside, smiles grown thin. JD straightened, glass still untouched, his decision as clear as the crystal in his hand. "So tonight," he finished, "I'll raise my glass, not to opportunity, not to progress, not to vision, but to the men and women out there still asking why and still waiting for an answer." And as he lifted the glass, not high, but just enough, the room's polite mask slipped, just for a moment. The storm had arrived. The glass in JD's hand caught the chandelier's light as he set it down, untouched, the final echo of his toe still hanging in the air. For a heartbeat, the room tried to recover, polite applause almost rising, lips parting to offer some practiced platitude that would smooth over the discomfort. But JD wasn't finished, and the weight in his voice made clear there would be no easy exit from what was coming. He didn't sit. He didn't soften. He let the stillness stretch just long enough for every person at that table to feel it press against their skin. Then he spoke again, not louder, but with a force that made the walls themselves seem to lean in. "I've heard a lot tonight about opportunity, about vision, about modernization." JD's eyes swept the room, taking in the faces that only moments ago had been so sure, so comfortable behind their masks. "But I want you to understand something. Opportunity that destroys families, vision that erases whole communities. That isn't progress. It's abandonment." The room shifted. Chairs creaked as guests tried to compose themselves. But their unease was showing now in the dart of their eyes, the tension in their shoulders, the fingers that gripped glasses a little too tight. JD's voice gained momentum, his words deliberate, steady, as if each one had been carved from the truth he carried with him. "The workers you're ready to forget. They built the towns that made this country strong. They kept faith when others gave up. And if you think they'll stay silent while their homes, their hopes, their lives are sold off for another percentage point on a balance sheet." He let the pause settle like a stone dropped in water, the ripples reaching every corner of the room. "You're wrong." A murmur rose, low and nervous, but JD kept going, his gaze sharper now, his stance unshaken. "If you forget my workers," he said, his voice rising, each word clean and cutting, "I will make sure the nation remembers them." The last word hadn't finished echoing before the silence took hold. The kind of silence that fills a space so completely it feels like sound will never return. A glass slipped from someone's hand near the far end of the table, shattering on the marble floor, the sharp crack slicing through the stillness. JD didn't flinch. He didn't move. He let the silence speak for him, and then slowly his gaze found the tycoon at the head of the table, the man who had offered him power, who had praised him moments before as if to claim him. JD's eyes locked with his, steady and unbought, and in that gaze was every promise JD had ever made. To Jackson Street, to Mama, to Papa, to every man and woman who'd ever believed in a better tomorrow. The tycoon's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder to read. Calculation, perhaps, or the first flicker of uncertainty from a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no. JD stood unmoving, the weight of the room's stairs pressing in on him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a promise fulfilled. The storm he'd felt coming all night had broken, and he had chosen where he stood. JD held the room's gaze for one final beat, the air thick with the weight of what had been said and what hadn't. Then, without another word, he set his glass down on the table. The crystal made a soft, final sound as it touched the polished wood, quieter than the shattered one still glinting on the floor, but far louder in its meaning. He straightened, his shoulders square, and turned from the table. His footsteps echoed against the marble, each one sharp and clear in the stunned hush that followed. No one called after him. No one moved to stop him. The power in the room had shifted, and for the first time all night, the masters of this house were left not knowing what move to make next. JD crossed the grand hall, its chandeliers now seeming colder, the gold leaf duller, the grandeur stripped of its illusion. The weight that had pressed on him all evening, the unspoken demands, the veiled offers, the promises laced with threats, seemed to fall away with each step he took. His pace was steady, unhurried, but inside, his mind burned with the clarity of what had just unfolded. As he passed through the massive doors and out beneath the arching portico, the night air hit him like a baptism. It was cold, biting at his skin, but clean in a way the air inside had not been. He paused at the top of the steps, drawing a slow, deep breath, letting the cold fill his lungs and clear the last traces of cigar smoke, of wine, of whispered schemes. For a brief moment, the doubt tried to creep in, a small voice at the edge of his mind that asked if he had just thrown away his chance to make a difference, if he had isolated himself beyond return, if the machine he'd just challenged was too vast, too entrenched, too practiced at crushing those who dared defy it. But the doubt passed as quickly as it came, burned away by the memory of Jackson Street, of Papa's tired but proud eyes, of Mama's quiet strength, of neighbors who deserved more than to be sold out behind closed doors. He knew then, as surely as he had known anything, that this night was not an ending. It was a beginning. The fight had begun, and this time it would be on his terms. He descended the steps, his footsteps softer now on the gravel of the drive. The car waited where he'd left it, its dark shape a familiar anchor in the uncertainty that lay ahead. As he reached for the door, JD glanced back once at the mansion, its windows glowing warm and golden against the night. A castle built not to shelter, but to separate. He felt no regret in turning his back on it. The engine rumbled to life, and as he steered down the long, curving drive, past the fountains and the gilded gates, JD felt the tension in his chest ease, replaced by something steadier: purpose. The estate receded behind him, swallowed by the dark, but the choice he had made tonight would not fade so easily. The fight had begun, and JD Vance was ready. The dawn broke cold and gray, casting a pale light over the Capitol dome as JD's car rolled back into the city. He hadn't slept. The night's choices played through his mind in relentless loops, but beneath the fatigue, a deeper resolve kept him steady. He knew the storm was coming. He just hadn't expected it to arrive so fast. By the time he reached his office, the headlines were everywhere. News had leaked before the sun was fully up, carried by voices eager to control the story. His staff met him with tight faces and jittering phones. A young aide held out a tablet, the screen glowing with the first wave of coverage. Senator Vance defies the elite at private power dinner. Populist grandstanding or act of courage. Vance shocks DC donors. The night JD Vance walked out. The photos were grainy, taken from a distance or by hands that shook at the risk of being caught. One showed him at the head of the table, standing tall, his glass untouched, the room's discomfort almost visible in the frozen faces around him. Another showed the back of him as he strode out beneath the mansion's arch, a silhouette framed by the glow of its lights. The networks ran loops of pundits talking over one another, parsing his motives, debating his future. On one channel, an anchor labeled his actions reckless populism that risked alienating needed allies. On another, he was hailed as a rare figure of integrity, a voice for the voiceless. Inside the office, the phones rang without pause. Donors demanding explanations, political allies offering cautious support or silent withdrawal, journalists seeking comment, union leaders sending messages of thanks, of solidarity, of hope. JD moved through it all with a quiet focus, listening, absorbing, knowing that this was the price of standing where he had. His staff looked to him, some worried, some inspired, all waiting to see how he would answer the noise that now surrounded him. The threats came quickly. A major donor hinted at pulling funding unless JD clarified, or better yet, softened, his position. A political action committee that had once praised his stance on manufacturing issued a statement expressing concern over his confrontational tone. Behind closed doors, JD knew more calls were being made, more plans laid to isolate him, to box him in. But there was the other side too, the voices that mattered most. Notes from labor unions poured in, short messages that spoke volumes. You spoke for us. Finally, someone who didn't sell us out. We're with you. And amid the swirl of commentary, JD felt the weight of it all pressed down. The storm had broken as he knew it would, and now he stood in the eye of it. The pressure was real, the kind that could bend a man if he let it. But JD didn't bend. Instead, he stood at his office window, looking out at the city below. The city where power was bartered, where influence was currency, and where, after last night, he'd drawn a line too clear to erase. His heart was steady, his mind sharp. The fight wasn't behind him. It was here now, and only just beginning. The requests for interviews had flooded in since dawn, but JD had turned them all down, until now. As the afternoon sun slanted through his office window, casting long shadows on the walls, he agreed to one. Just one. Not with a network known for its sensationalism, not with a face that chased the loudest headlines, but with a journalist he respected. A veteran anchor who still believed questions mattered more than ratings. The studio was quiet, the set designed to look casual, but JD felt the weight of the moment the second the cameras rolled. There was no audience, no applause to greet him, no crowd to hide behind, just the bright, unblinking eye of the lens, and beyond it, a nation waiting to see whether he would stand by the words that had shaken the night before. The interviewer didn't waste time. Senator Vance, the country is talking about what you did. Some call it grandstanding, others call it courage. What do you call it? JD paused, not for effect, but because he wanted to get it right. His voice, when it came, was low even. I didn't go there to make a scene. I went because I needed to see for myself, to hear what's said when the doors are closed, and what I heard. He let the thought hang, heavy in the air. What I heard broke my heart, but it didn't surprise me. The anchor leaned forward, softening his tone. They say you insulted men who've supported this nation's economy, who've created jobs. JD shook his head, the trace of a sad smile at the edge of his mouth. They tried to buy my voice, but I'm not for sale. The words landed like a bell ringing clear across the country. In the control room, producers exchanged glances, sensing the power of the moment. On screen, JD sat steady, hands folded, gaze unwavering. Not a man seeking attention, but a man who had already made his peace with what he'd done. He didn't stop there. He spoke of the towns left hollow when factories closed, of parents who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't keep the lights on, of young people leaving home because there was nothing left to stay for. He spoke not of himself, but of them, the ones no one at that mansion table had mentioned the night before. I wasn't elected to protect the comfortable, JD said. I was sent here to speak for the forgotten, And I'll keep doing that, no matter who tries to silence me. The interview wrapped with no fireworks, no stage drama, just JD's quiet resolve, etched in every word. But when the clip hit the airwaves, it moved faster than anyone expected. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared on social media, replayed on local news, quoted in headlines that, for once, didn't twist the meaning of what was said. They tried to buy my voice, but I'm not for sale. The line appeared on posters, in hashtags, on signs waved at rallies. Small communities that had long felt invisible saw in JD's stand a reflection of their own anger, their own hope. Labor groups that had struggled for attention found new energy in the clarity of his defiance. And as the evening wore on, as JD sat at his desk listening to the hum of the city beyond, he knew that the fire had been lit, and it wasn't his alone anymore. The fire JD had lit burned bright, but fires draw storms, and the storm came swift and merciless. By dawn the next day, the billionaire class had begun its counterattack, moving not with outrage, but with cold, calculated precision. The headlines shifted. The same outlets that had once praised JD's rise now questioned his motives. Is Senator Vance playing to the crowd? Populist posturing? Is Vance undermining bipartisan progress? Anonymous op-eds appeared, their authors hidden behind titles like senior economic strategist or longtime party donor, each dripping with warnings of recklessness cloaked as principle. Television pundits spoke in polished tones about his political immaturity, about how real change required compromise, about how JD Vance was endangering the very communities he claimed to champion by alienating job creators. One network ran a segment looping his interview, but with dramatic music and selective cuts, painting him as dangerous, impulsive, divisive. And behind the cameras, in the corridors of power, the squeeze tightened. Donors pulled their calls. Fundraisers were quietly canceled. Some colleagues who had once clapped him on the back in the Senate chamber now avoided his gaze in the halls. Invitations vanished. His name was struck from certain meetings, certain dinners, certain circles. JD saw it all, felt the chill in every handshake that didn't come, heard it in every silence that met him, where once there'd been encouragement. But if they thought to bend him, they failed. Each attack, each withdrawal, each whispered slight hardened him. This was the price of standing, and he would pay it. Still, even resolve could not mask the weight of it. And after days of unrelenting pressure, JD did what he'd known he would. He went home. Not to retreat, but to remember why he'd started this fight in the first place. The town hadn't changed. Jackson Street still bore its cracks like badges of endurance. The mill still stood silent, its windows dark, its walls tagged with the faded marks of time and loss. The corner store where he'd once spent nickels on candy was boarded up now. The paint peeling, the sign rusted through. Word spread that JD was back, and before long, they found him. The neighbors, the shopkeepers who were left, the former factory workers, the single parents, the kids who had grown up too fast. They didn't bring banners. They didn't bring applause. They brought questions. "What do we do now, Senator?" one man asked, his face lined by years of worry, his hands calloused from work that barely paid the bills. A woman stood beside him, her eyes tired but fierce. "They're not going to let you do this easy. We see it. So tell us, what's next?" JD looked at them, really looked, at the strength, the struggle, the hope that refused to die no matter how often it was betrayed. The media could call him what they liked. The billionaires could smear him, isolate him, try to erase him. But here in the place that made him, he saw the only truth that mattered. The fire hadn't been his alone to light, and it wouldn't be his alone to carry. The storm was far from over. But as JD stood among his people, the question they asked was the answer he needed. They were ready to fight alongside him. Now it was time to show them how. The school gym smelled faintly of sawdust and old varnish, the kind of scent that clung to floors polished too many times, and walls that had heard decades of cheers, pledges, and promises. The folding chairs were mismatched, some wobbling slightly on uneven legs, but they were filled, every last one. And still, people stood along the back wall, crowded in along the bleachers, eager not to miss a word. There were no cameras, No reporters scribbling in notebooks or microphones thrust toward faces. No suits, no polished speeches. Just neighbors, families, workers, and JD Vance at the front, sleeves rolled up, no podium between him and the people he'd come to serve. He didn't start with a speech. He didn't want applause. He wanted the truth, their truth. So he stood there, hands at his sides, and invited them to speak. And they did. One by one, they rose. A man in his 50s, eyes tired but voice steady, spoke of losing his job at the plant and watching his son move states away to find work. A woman cradling a baby on her hip talked of juggling 2 part-time jobs and still coming up short when the rent was due. A teenager, barely old enough to vote, spoke of watching friends drop out of school because they saw no future worth staying for. JD listened, really listened. He let the stories fill the room, let the weight of them settle deep. He nodded, asked questions, took notes on a pad worn at the corners from constant use. The anger in their voices was matched only by the hope beneath it. Hope that someone was finally listening, finally willing to do more than offer empty words. A man near the back, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands scarred from years of factory work, spoke with quiet intensity. "Senator, we don't need speeches. We need a plan. We're ready to work. We're ready to stand. But tell us, where do we start?" The room murmured in agreement, heads nodding, eyes fixed on JD, and for a moment he felt the enormity of it. The trust, the urgency, the need. These weren't voters chasing promises. These were people who'd been failed too many times, who still dared to believe in something better. JD stepped forward, his voice steady but low, as if speaking to each person individually. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. And it starts with knowing what we're up against, with naming it out loud. They want you divided, discouraged, too tired to fight. But I've seen what's in this room tonight, and I know they're wrong." He let the words hang, not as a declaration, but as a starting point. The gym felt charged, not with fury, but with resolve. The meeting stretched on into the night, long past when the custodian flicked the lights in the hall, long past when the youngest children fell asleep against their parents' shoulders. And through it all, JD kept listening, because he knew that before he could lead, he had to understand. When the crowd finally drifted out into the night air, JD stood alone for a moment, the echo of their voices still filling the quiet. The path ahead was clearer now, lit not by his ambition, but by their stories. And he knew the next steps would belong to them all. The town hall voices stayed with JD long after the gym had emptied. They echoed in the quiet of his car on the drive back to Washington, in the stillness of his apartment, in the hum of the Capitol's late-night corridors. Every story shared that night weighed on him, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he could no longer postpone. And so, while the city slept, JD began. His office became a second home, the lights burning long past midnight, the windows darkened against the city's glow, the desk scattered with yellow pads, index cards, and legal drafts covered in margin notes. He worked without the fanfare of press conferences or prepared sound bites. No cameras documented these nights. There was only the scratch of his pen, the quiet click of a keyboard, and the low hum of the building around him. He started with the heart of it. Jobs. How to protect the ones that remained. How to give small factories, local shops, and independent mills a fighting chance against forces determined to gut them for profit. He drafted provisions that would close loopholes used to justify offshoring, that would tie tax incentives to job retention, that would reward businesses investing in their communities rather than abandoning them. Next came the safeguards for small industries, grants for modernization that wouldn't require them to sell out to giants, protections against predatory buyouts, support for apprenticeships that could give young people a reason to stay, to build, to believe. The hours blurred together. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, past 2, past 4. At times, JD rubbed his eyes, stared out at the Capitol dome, and wondered if what he was trying to do was too much, if the machine he'd seen up close that night at the mansion would simply grind this effort down as it had so many others. There were moments of doubt, sharp and sudden, the kind that crept in when the coffee had gone cold and the page stayed blank too long. Moments when he questioned if one bill, one man, could shift the weight of a system built to serve the powerful. But then he'd glance at a scrap of paper on his desk, a torn page from his notes at the town hall. 4 words, scrawled in his own hand. What do we do now? That question pulled him forward, steadied him, reminded him that this wasn't about easy victories or grand gestures. It was about trying, about standing, about writing down the words that needed to exist, even if the fight to make them law would be long and brutal. And so the draft took shape, line by line, night after night. He consulted with staffers who shared his vision, with legal experts who had grown tired of seeing policy written by those who'd never walked the streets they claimed to serve. He filled pages with notes in the margins. Too weak, fix. Make this airtight. No giveaways, not this time. When the dawn broke over the Capitol, casting soft light through his office window, JD leaned back, weary but resolved. The first draft lay before him. Not perfect, not final, but real. A beginning. He gathered the papers, smoothed the edges, and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself a small, tired smile. The bill was only words on a page for now, but soon those words would be read, debated, fought over. And JD was ready. When JD stepped onto the Senate floor, the weight of the moment felt heavier than the marble columns that loomed above him. The bill he carried in his hands was no longer just paper. It was a declaration of where he stood and a challenge to the forces arrayed against the communities he'd sworn to protect. The chamber was full, the usual hum of side conversations quieter than usual, as if even those who planned to oppose him knew something different was happening today. He began to speak, voice steady, words chosen not for drama but for truth. JD spoke of towns hollowed out, of families uprooted, of factories shuttered not because they failed, but because they were sacrificed for profit. He spoke of workers who still rose before dawn to earn an honest living, only to find the rules rewritten while they slept. He spoke of the bill, modest in some ways, ambitious in others, designed to give those communities a fighting chance. As he spoke, he saw the faces watching him. Some listened with genuine interest, heads nodding slightly at his points, eyes reflecting a spark of respect. Others smirked, exchanging glances, arms folded as if bracing for the speech they'd already decided to dismiss. A few stared down at their papers or phones, unwilling to meet his gaze, perhaps because they knew the truth of what he said and could not bear to face it. The debate that followed was fierce. Supporters rose to defend the bill's merits, arguing that it was a necessary correction to decades of neglect. Opponents called it overreach, naive, a threat to economic freedom. Some cloaked their objections in polite language. Others didn't bother, casting JD's proposal as little more than populist pandering. JD stood through it all, listening, responding where he could, refusing to let the barbs rattle him. He knew the vote would be close, closer than the insiders had predicted, and that this was only the first battle in what would be a long campaign. When the vote was called, the numbers came in as expected, and yet still, they stung. The bill fell short, the final tally displayed on the board for all to see, a loss on paper. But as JD scanned the chamber, he saw something more. Senators who had crossed expected lines to support it, colleagues who had hesitated before voting no, their discomfort plain. The battle lines were drawn now, clearer than ever. And if the bill had failed today, it had also planted a flag. The conversation had shifted. The fight had begun in earnest. JD left the chamber not defeated, but determined. The halls felt different now, not because they changed, but because he had. And as he walked toward the doors, he knew the work ahead would be harder still. But that was the work worth doing. The bill had fallen short, but something far larger had taken root. JD hadn't expected it, not so soon. But in the weeks that followed the vote, a quiet ripple turned into a wave. Across the country, smaller bills began appearing, drafted by lawmakers who, inspired or challenged by JD's stand, had decided to try their own hand at change. Some mirrored his proposals exactly. Others adapted them, focusing on specific industries or regions. What they shared was the heart of it, a refusal to let small towns die quietly, And beyond the halls of government, the people stirred. In cities and towns JD had never set foot in, workers gathered. They wrote letters, held rallies, demanded meetings with officials who for too long had offered only empty promises. Some crowds numbered in the dozens, others in the thousands. Handmade signs bore slogans drawn from JD's own words. Not for sale. Remember us. If you forget us, we will not forget you. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. The machine JD had faced that night at the mansion wasn't broken, but for the first time in years, people had begun to see its gears, to question who it served and why. JD worked quietly through it all. He didn't chase cameras or headlines. Instead, he visited the places that had been told they didn't matter. And one morning, he found himself at the gates of a small factory that had reopened its doors. A local investor, moved by the national conversation, had stepped in where giants would not. The factory was modest, its machinery old but reliable. The smell of oil and iron filled the air as JD walked through, shaking hands, listening to workers describe what it meant to be back. One man, grease on his sleeves, gripped JD's hand longer than most. "You reminded us we're worth fighting for," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "That counts for something." JD left that day without fanfare, but with a quiet victory carried in his heart. Change was slow, but it had begun. The days blurred with travel, meetings, drafting new proposals. But one night, in the quiet of his office, JD found an envelope on his desk. No official seal, no printed return address, just his name, written in a careful, almost nervous hand. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the kind pulled from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was uneven, the words simple, but their weight undeniable. "Senator Vance, I'm just one guy. I work at a hardware store back home. I don't know politics, and I don't have a lot. But I saw what you did. I saw how you spoke for us. And I want you to know, you made us believe again that maybe someone in that big building really does see us. So thank you." JD read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into his wallet, where it rested behind his ID, beside a photo of Mama. He would carry it with him, a reminder in moments of doubt of why he had chosen the harder road. And in that quiet, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt purpose, renewed and unshaken. It was dusk when JD returned to Jackson Street, the sun slipping behind the rooftops, casting the town in shades of gold and shadow. He walked alone, no entourage, no reporters, just a man retracing the path that had made him. The street was as he remembered. Cracked sidewalks, sagging porches, the quiet hum of televisions through open windows. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The smell of cut grass mingled with the faint scent of motor oil from a nearby garage. JD moved slowly, taking it all in. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, their glow soft against the deepening blue of the sky. He passed the lot where the old grocery had once stood, the house where Mama had raised him, the empty storefronts that whispered of what had been lost. But tonight, the street didn't feel forgotten. Tonight, it felt like a place waiting to be remembered. He paused at the corner, hands in his pockets, and let the weight of the journey settle over him. The fights won and lost, the voices he carried with him, the choices made in rooms of power and in the quiet moments that followed. "They called me naive," JD murmured, his words barely louder than the evening breeze. "They called me stubborn, but they'll never say I forgot them." He stood there until the stars began to show, until the sounds of the town settled into nighttime's hush. And as he turned to walk back down Jackson Street, his steps steady, his resolve firm, JD knew the fight was far from over. But tonight he had no doubt. He would keep walking it. For them. For all of them. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't about comfort or applause. It's about choosing the harder path when it matters most. About standing up for those who can't always be in the room where decisions are made. JD Vance's journey shows the quiet power of listening, of courage, and of refusing to be bought or silenced. The fight for fairness isn't easy, and change doesn't come overnight. But when one voice dares to speak, it can light a spark that others will carry forward. And maybe that's what hope really is. Knowing that even in the face of giants, one person's stand can inspire a movement. What do you think it takes to stand up when it feels like the world wants you to sit down? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.